Rain stitched the sky shut, and the road wore it like a funeral veil. I drove into it anyway, the wipers beating their slow metronome. A tired heart in a steel ribcage, the forest rose on either side. Pin-straight pines like an honor guard, black and watchful, the needles whispering a secret I didn't know yet. Headlights tunneled through the mist in pale cones, and the asphalt shone like a serpent's back, slick and patient. The world had been narrowing for miles. Fewer houses, fewer lights, fewer reasons to keep talking to myself just to hear a human voice. A song on the radio fractured in the static and became a ghost, the kind that hums along with you even when you don't. I should have turned it off. I should have stopped for coffee in the last lit town and waited out the storm. But the night had me by the coat and I let it lead. The yellow lines bent around a shoulder of stone, and I followed, a courteous mistake, when the curve tightened. The tires gave their small warning cry, a slipping squeal, and then the road shrugged me loose. Everything afterward happened the way violence always does, quickly, and with a terrible attention to detail. The steering wheel kicked against my hands as if it wanted to get away. Gravel spat through the wheel wells. The guardrail flashed by like a grin with too many teeth. I felt the car leave the last safe inch of pavement and float, a moment of saintly silence, and then the drop, a blind tumble through brush and wet leaves. The shudder of bark raking the door, the hard punctuation of rock against metal. The seatbelt bit my shoulder like a loyal dog that doesn't know how to help. The roof caved, the windshield blossomed into 1,000 glittering facts, and I rolled with the chassis until down became up and up became a theory. When it ended hard. The car lay on its back like something hunted, wheels dumbly spinning, a slow windmill in the dark. Smoke uncoiled from the hood, patient and grey, and the smell of gasoline rose like a prayer no one answers. Blood found its way down my temple and tapped the corner of my mouth. I tasted copper and rain and the grit of the world that had just tried to throw me off. There was sound somewhere, the soft drumming of water through needles, the mechanical tick of a cooling engine, the hush before pain learns your name. I hung in the harness of the belt, a skewed marionette, watching a droplet gather at the tip of a shard, swell let go, fall to meet my cheek. The radio had not learned its lesson. It murmured a half-song, a broken chorus about burning of all things, and the words misted in and out like breath on glass. Heat began its quiet arithmetic under the hood. Orange found a seam and pressed its face to it. The first tentative flames licked along a cable, tasted insulating plastic, and grew bolder. Smoke plumped into a dark lung. I reached for the buckle with stiff fingers, felt the stubborn square of it under my thumb, and failed to make persuasion into action. My shoulder pulsed. My ribs made their crunchy little confession, and the belt's webbing dug higher into my throat. I thought about all the useless advice that rushes in at the end. Stay calm, conserve energy, think of something beautiful. I thought of a photograph I'd held once of the sea at dusk. No horizon, only silver water and a sky the same color. The world briefly undecided about what it was. I wanted that quiet. The car, generous, offered a different kind. The forest paid attention. You can feel it when it does. The rain changed key, softened, then stopped under the trees as if the canopy had spread its hands. Shushing the storm, the wind moved once, a patient hand along the pines, and then even the needles held their breath. The little fire found a bigger idea and coughed. Somewhere to my left, lower down the slope, a branch let go of its weight and fell with the sound of something choosing a side. I spoke a name that wasn't mine and didn't belong to anyone I'd ever known. It left my mouth like a moth, fluttered and died in the smoke. The air thickened. The heat put a palm on my cheek. My heart did what hearts do when they realize they've been left alone. Sprinted, stumbled, sprinted again. Then the forest made a different sound. Low at first, like thunder overheard from a room away, not wind. Not the familiar complaint of a broken machine. Something with a spine, something that existed in the singular. The noise came again, closer, a weighted step that had learned how to be careful and decided not to be. Brush parted with the wet rip of stitched fabric. The pines, who had been practicing being statues all their lives, tilted in the smallest bough. My eyes caught the first thing they could understand, light returning to me from a pair of points in the dark. Not reflections, attention. The color was wrong for the human world, a cold lantern glow that carried its own weather. They moved once, a patient blink, and then held. In that gaze was the geography of a thing that did not need maps. The car's little fire dimmed, ashamed of its imitation of power, then flared brighter, trying to be brave. The smell in the air changed. Not animal musk, not wet fur, something older, a mineral bite like stone that remembers lightning. The shape stepped out of the trees and drew the night around it like a coat, height first, then breadth, then the articulation of a body built for a purpose we've spent centuries giving names to and pretending not to believe in. The head turned, the narrow of the muzzle cutting a dark line across the light of the burning ruin, and the ears set like arrowheads, listening to the last of my fear find its way into the open. The buckle still would not surrender. The fire coughed black and reached for me with a novice's hand. I closed my eyes because that is what we do when the old stories step forward to check our pulse. The forest held its breath. The rain waited at the edge of the leaves. The night's mouth opened wider, and something in it, all claw and decision, answered. The forest had gone mute, as though every living thing had retreated behind a curtain and left me to the stage. The only sound was the throb of blood in my ears and the groan of metal around me. Then it came again, the tread of something heavy, deliberate, the weight of each step sinking into the mud like an oath. It wasn't the panicked scampering of deer or the cautious crack of a hunter. This was confidence, ownership. The glow of the fire bent around the figure as it emerged. It was not immediate. First, the shadow of antlers flickered across the trees, though no stag could walk with such a gait. Then shoulders too broad for any human silhouette. Muscles rolling under fur slicked with rain. At last the head lowered into view, a muzzle long and deliberate, eyes gleaming with the pallor of moons drowned in water. It was wrong, and yet right, something the world should never have. And something the world had clearly been waiting for. The werewolf, its breath clouded the air, steaming in waves that mixed with smoke, until the entire world seemed stitched from fire and fog. The ears flicked once, taking in the last cry of the dying engine, then pinned back. My body stiffened against the harness. I braced for the inevitability of pain, the brutal final punctuation on a night that had already chosen me as its victim. The wolf leaned close, and the smell hit me, earthy, copper-rich, the mineral tang of caves and graves, the wild scent of something that had never agreed to live inside walls. Its teeth glistened in the flicker, uneven but strong, like stones sharpened by a river. I could see strands of saliva stretch and snap, each droplet catching a different hue from the flames. The car surrendered to heat with a groan, glass cracking as fire pushed through seams. The creature's claws tapped once against the roof. Testing the metal, that sound rattled through me. Steel against steel, sharper than any siren could be. I clenched my fists, useless gestures of defiance, and waited for the tearing, but it did not strike. It studied me instead. Head tilted, breath heavy, eyes never blinking. There was no malice, not yet. Only consideration, a kind of patient cruelty, as though I were a specimen pinned beneath glass. And then slowly, it lowered its muzzle until I could see my reflection warped across its eyes. Broken, bloodied, helpless. For a heartbeat, I thought it pitied me. The thought shattered when it moved. Fast, decisive. It slammed one hand into the crumpled frame, claws sinking into the steel like a knife into butter. With a wrench, it tore the door free, flinging it into the dark where it landed with a scream of metal. Sparks lit the forest floor. Brief fireflies crushed beneath rain. I flinched, expecting the claws next across my chest, but they hooked instead into the roof. Another rip, another violent shriek of surrender from the machine. The werewolf was peeling it open, section by section, each motion fueled by power I could not measure. The car groaned its death rattle, and through its agony I realized what was happening. It wasn't hunting me, it was digging me out. My breath hitched. Pain flared in my ribs, blood pooled in my mouth. But I swallowed it down. The wolf leaned again, catching the seatbelt with one hooked claw, and with a single contemptuous swipe. It severed the strap. I dropped into its waiting grasp. My body cradled against fur that was damp, coarse, and radiating a terrible heat. The world outside blurred as it hauled me from the wreck. I hung like a child in a giant's arms, my chest pressed against the beast's frame, my ears filled with the pounding of a heart far too fast, far too strong. Behind us, the car coughed flame into the trees, a dying dragon consumed by its own fire. Ahead of me, the wolf carried me into the mud. its steps unhurried, certain, purposeful. I had been spared for now, but the mystery clawed deeper than the pain. Was this mercy or a more intimate kind of possession? The howl hadn't come yet, but I felt it trembling in the creature's chest, waiting to be born, a sound that would split the night in two. The fire was no longer patient. It climbed eagerly now, greedy tongues licking higher as if the forest itself had been chosen as tinder. Sparks fluttered in the air like malignant stars, drifting toward the treetops where the pines swayed in reluctant warning. The night smelled of gasoline, wet earth, and smoke. I coughed, my lungs scraping themselves raw, every breath pulling pain through my ribs. Yet I was still in motion, still being carried, as though death had tripped at the finish line and handed me off to something far older and stranger. The werewolf lowered me onto the ground with a deliberation I did not expect. Mud clung to my skin, cool and damp, seeping into torn fabric. For an instant, I lay there like discarded meat, waiting for jaws to close around my throat. My body knew how prey should end. My heart hammered against the script, desperate to keep pace with its own panic. Instead, the creature turned its attention back to the wreck. It stalked around the husk of the car, with the grimness of a judge circling the gallows. Then it struck again, both claws plunging into twisted steel, ripping apart what little shape remained. The roof shrieked open, showering embers. Windows shattered under its weight. With a grunt, it wrenched the entire chassis onto its side, flames spilling from the cracked engine like a bleeding wound. For a moment the beast looked almost furious, not at me, not at the fire, but at the cage that had threatened to claim me. Its shoulders heaved, chest rising and falling like a bellows, a furnace working through rage. Each exhale steamed into the night, a mist that curled in strange patterns, as if the air itself bent around its will. The heat grew unbearable. The gas tank gave its last cough. A column of fire roared skyward, bursting in a flare that painted the forest in violent orange. Trees groaned. The shadows of the wolf stretched across the ground. Monstrous and biblical, too large for one body, too ancient for one name, it stepped between me and the explosion, its body a wall of fur and flesh that shielded me from the blast. I should have been ash. Instead, I lay stunned, watching the silhouette of my rescuer against the inferno. Its fur shimmered in the heat, slick and black. Every scar across its hide illuminated like script written in fire. When the blast settled into steady burning, the werewolf tilted its head back. The howl came. It wasn't sound. It was a wound in the night. The note climbed, split, fractured into harmonies that should not exist. It shook the marrow inside my bones, rattled the fillings in my teeth, made the earth itself vibrate with recognition. Every tree in the forest seemed to lean away from it. Every living creature paused mid-breath. My vision blurred as tears leaked without consent, as though my body was answering a summons written into it long before birth. The howl didn't just fill the air, it carved into it, etched itself into the silence so deeply that even when it ended, the echo remained. The wolf lowered its head, its chest still quivering with the resonance of its own cry. Slowly it turned, its eyes fixing on me once again. This time something was different. Not judgment, not hunger, something colder, more binding, as though the howl had been a proclamation, and I was the subject of it. The mud was cool beneath my hands, yet my skin burned, my wounds pulsed strangely, the bleeding slowing in ways the body should not allow. I pressed trembling fingers to my arm and found the claw marks it had left when dragging me free. They weren't deep enough to maim, but they glowed in the firelight like a signature. The beast lingered there a moment longer, just enough for me to see my reflection in its eyes. Broken, bloodied, alive against every law of nature. Then, without sound, it stepped back into the tree line, the flames outlining its retreat until even that silhouette dissolved into darkness. I lay alone in the wreckage's afterglow, half believing I had been chosen, half fearing I had been claimed. The forest once again pretended nothing had happened. But inside me something had already begun. Smoke wrapped the forest in a shroud, heavy and acrid, weaving between the trees as if the night itself had begun to breathe differently. The wreck roared behind me, flames collapsing the frame inward until the car resembled nothing more than a burning pyre. Sparks climbed and died in the canopy, showering embers like malignant fireflies. I lay on the ground trembling, mud cold against my cheek, my body refusing to decide whether it still belonged to me. The werewolf did not vanish entirely. It lingered at the edge of the tree line, a towering silhouette drawn in strokes of shadow and flame. Every detail of it seemed etched into memory with the cruelty of permanence. The breadth of its shoulders, the rise and fall of its chest, the twitch of ears sharp enough to carve silence. It stood like a sentinel, not a predator, its eyes reflecting the fire with that same pale, impossible glow. The longer it watched, the more the world bent around its presence. The forest had not returned to normal. No owl dared to call, no wind threaded through the branches. Even the rain hesitated at the edge of leaves, waiting for permission. The only sound was the ruin behind me, and the echo of that howl still vibrating in my bones. I could not tell if it had ended minutes ago or was still going on. Too vast to hear with mortal ears, the heat from the wreck pressed against my back. My skin prickled with the ache of burns that never quite took hold. As though something unseen kept the worst of it from me, I coughed again, blood bubbling up, and the pain sharpened into focus. My ribs grated when I tried to move. A grinding protest that nearly drew me back into unconsciousness. Yet I forced my eyes open, forced myself to find the wolf again, to be certain I hadn't dreamed it. It was still there, still watching. For an instant, our gazes locked. The fire cracked, a branch snapped, and the beast tilted its head in that unsettling, too human gesture of curiosity. Then it shifted its weight, stepped closer, just enough for the earth to register the impact, just enough for my lungs to seize with terror. It crouched, leaned into the firelight, and exhaled. The breath rolled over me, hot and damp, carrying the wild scent of fur and rain and blood. It brushed my face like a benediction, leaving me shivering under the weight of recognition. And then it was gone. No rustle of leaves, no thud of departure. One moment it filled the clearing. The next it dissolved into the dark, as if the forest had folded it back into its own skin. The silence it left was worse than its presence, an absence too loud, a void that pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I turned my head toward the wreck and saw only fire collapsing inward, sending up a pillar of smoke. The heat carved halos into the air. The flames devoured my belongings, my history, my name, and yet I felt no grief, only the terrible weight of survival. I should not have been here, and still I was, somewhere in the haze of smoke and mud. Exhaustion pulled me under, the forest blurred, firelight flickering across my closing eyes, claw marks on my arm glowing faintly like coals under skin. I collapsed into the dark, my body conceding to a sleep that was closer to drowning. The last thing I remembered before the world surrendered was the faint echo of that howl, not from the trees, not from the night, but from within me, vibrating in the hollow of my ribs. It did not sound like warning, it sounded like a claim. Light was the first betrayal, not the flicker of fire, not the cold lantern of those eyes, but the sterile blaze of fluorescence. White ceiling tiles, clean as bleached bone, swam into focus above me. Machines hummed in patient rhythm at my side. The air smelled of disinfectant and iron, sharp and lifeless. I had been dragged from the forest into another kind of cage. A hospital. Voices moved beyond the curtain, clipped and professional, punctuated by the shuffle of paper. I shifted, and pain came with me, a familiar companion pressing against ribs wrapped in tight bandages. My arm throbbed. The claw marks remained, raw and deliberate. The nurses said nothing about them. They spoke instead of luck, of miracles, of the kind of survival they didn't see twice in a career. The doctors came with their cold logic, wearing stethoscopes like talismans. They told me the seatbelt had saved me. The roll of the car had spared my neck. The fire had been quenched by rain. They built an altar to coincidence and expected me to kneel. I nodded, played the part of the grateful survivor, but inside I was screaming, not from pain but from certainty. None of their explanations mattered. None could erase the image of claws tearing steel like parchment, of a beast standing between me and fire at night. When the halls fell silent and only the soft beeping of monitors kept time, I closed my eyes. That was when the hospital walls betrayed me. The sheets turned cold, and I was back in the forest. Smoke stung my throat, sparks drifted above me. Those pale eyes pinned me again, bright with judgment and something worse, recognition. I woke each time with a gasp, sweat plastering my skin, monitors scolding me with their shrill alarms. No one believed what I told them. They nodded, sympathetic, as if trauma had painted hallucinations across my memory. A nurse patted my hand and whispered that near-death plays tricks on the mind. A doctor explained the science of shock, how the brain rewrites terror into monsters. Their smiles were soft, dismissive. Their words were knives wrapped in cotton. But I knew because of the mark. The claw wounds did not fester. They did not sting like ordinary cuts. Instead, they healed with an unnatural speed, sealing into pale scars within days. Faint lines carved into my flesh like a brand, and when I touched them, a tremor passed through me, low and insistent, like the memory of that howl buried in the marrow of my bones. The crash investigators came to ask questions. They told me my car had been found as a skeleton of metal and soot. They showed me photographs, steel bent outward, as though something had pried it open with colossal hands. I watched their faces as they struggled with the evidence, eyes darting, voices careful. They wanted an explanation. They would not accept the truth, I lied, because the truth had no place in their mouths. I said I didn't remember. That smoke and fire had erased it all. But the lie tasted bitter, because every time I closed my eyes, the scene replayed in perfect clarity. The claws, the strength, the howl. And every night I lay awake in that white bed. The echo grew louder, crawling from my ribs to my throat. Begging to be released, the hospital called me healed. They sent me back into the world, scarred but alive, walking on bones that should have splintered, breathing with lungs that should have collapsed. They called me lucky. They did not understand that luck had nothing to do with it. I had been spared, not by medicine, not by fate, but by something ancient that had pulled me out of fire and claimed me in silence. And the world I returned to, bright, ordinary human, felt smaller, flimsier, as if paper walls stood between me and a truth with claws. Home no longer felt like home. The walls, painted in soft colors, meant to soothe, pressed too tightly around me, every sound carried wrong. The ticking of a clock was too sharp, the hum of the refrigerator too low, the footsteps of neighbors above me too heavy, as if the world itself had been dialed louder while I was gone. I could hear things I had never heard before, the creak of old wood beams, the distant groan of pipes, the thrum of traffic blocks away. My body was becoming an antenna, tuned to frequencies no one else could sense. But it wasn't just sound. My skin itched where the scars traced my arm. 3 precise lines, pale against flesh. At night they pulsed faintly, as though veins beneath them carried fire instead of blood. When I pressed my fingers to them, I felt warmth, alive and insistent. Like the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't mine, I tried to sleep. Sleep betrayed me. The dreams came in pieces, jagged and uninvited. I stood in the forest again, not as I remembered it, but through a stranger's eyes, low to the ground, every scent rich with meaning. Every rustle alive with threat. I smelled fear, not my own, but human fear, sharp and acrid. The world was painted in silver and shadow, and the moon loomed so close it felt like a command. My body in the dream ran without question. Muscles coiling, claws sinking into soil, breath tearing out in snarls. I woke with dirt under my nails and the taste of blood on my tongue. Though no wound marked me, the doctors said trauma explains such things, that the mind works through terror by weaving nightmares. But nightmares don't leave paw prints in the hallway, mud drying in patterns too large for any dog. Nightmares don't leave windows unlocked when you know you closed them. The mark on my arm became my proof. Each day it faded less, as if the scar refused to yield to time. Once in the bathroom mirror, I watched the lines glow faintly under moonlight, pale fire spreading beneath the skin. My reflection blurred for an instant, not human, not whole. A suggestion of something longer in the jaw, sharper in the eyes. It vanished when I blinked. But the impression remained. Neighbors began to whisper. They said I looked different, gaunter yet stronger, like someone hollowed out but filled with new fuel. A friend clasped my shoulder once and jerked back, startled, swearing she felt heat radiate through my shirt as if fever lived beneath. I laughed it off. Inside I trembled, because it wasn't just me noticing. The forest called. I would drive past the tree line and feel the tug. Magnetic, undeniable. Nights I heard howls carried on the wind, too deep, too close, and when they came, my scars burned, each line throbbing as though answering a summons. I pressed a pillow over my head, tried to bury the sound, but it crawled into me anyway, vibrating along bone and marrow. I began to wonder if the rescue had been mercy at all, or if it had been initiation. The mark was no wound. It was a signature, a claim scrawled in flesh, a promise that I no longer belonged fully to myself. And with each passing night, as the moon grew fat and pale in the sky, I felt less like the person who had crawled into that car, and more like something waiting to crawl out of me. The howl was no longer memory. It lived inside me now, pacing, restless, waiting for the right phase of the moon to tear its way free. The moon came back into my life like an overdue debt collector. Patient and inevitable, it climbed into the sky, indifferent to my small human bargains. And when it was full, the nights began to taste different, metallic, bright, as if the world had been rewired and I'd been left with the loose end. Each month the pull grew, my sleep thinned, my patience thinned. The polite borders of my life, work, friends, coffee, meetings, felt like paper doors against a storm that kept learning new ways to open them. The first time it came for me properly, I thought I was having a seizure. My body folded in on itself, a physical answer to a summons I did not understand. I woke later in the dark with damp hair, breath hot and strange in my throat. With the taste of the forest in my mouth, the mirror told me what the rest of me suspected. Eyes rimmed with raw silver, nails long and ragged as if I'd been digging to the center of the earth. The scar on my arm flared like a brand. I could feel the muscle under my skin rearranging itself, adapting to a design older than doctors and glass. But the transformation was not the monster story I had always been told. It did not begin with pain and rage alone. There was a clarity, a sharpened focus, a sense of purpose that moved through me like a new skeleton. My hearing stretched. My smell remembered whole biographies in the scent of spilled coffee. The world's lies fell away as if someone had turned off a light where there had been noise. Now there was map, the slight tremor of a truck 2 miles off, the secret of a neighbor's dog's limp, the whisper of last night's argument leaking through a wall. I tried to resist. I stayed indoors on full moons, lined the windows with wet towels and old quilts, and wrapped my feet in blankets like a child trying to bargain the morning into staying. It helped for a while, enough that I could believe denial was an effective strategy, but the forest has patience. The fever that lived beneath my ribs pulled, and eventually it won. The first time I ran with the pack I did not know existed. I did not run like a beast, so much as rejoin a conversation I had been artificially excluded from. The speed was not terror, it was familiarity. The hunt that night was less about killing and more about a kind of ritual agreement gone wrong somewhere in history and now being repaired. When you are claimed by something that saved you, the gratitude is a thorn. I found myself replaying the rescue in the hospital like a hymn. The beast had given me breath. It had wrenched me from fire and from the finality of the car. I owed it, but the currency it accepted was different. Nights given, preferences erased, a portion of my waking life rearranged around its appetite. The townsfolk noticed. They called it change and labeled me irritable and withdrawn. Some offered concerned smiles. Others kept distance, eyes flicking to the scars like people checking for contagious marks. I wanted to tell them the truth, but every confession felt smaller than the thing that had been done to me. Language is made for the social, not for the mythical. Besides, words are poor substitutes when your nights are no longer yours. There were moments of grace too. Once, when a car had veered off the road in the same curve that had nearly killed me, I found myself there, before the sirens, before the crowd, crouched in mud and rain with a presence I recognized, the ghost of that great shape at my shoulder. We worked together, ripping, hauling, dragging bodies from metal that wanted to keep them. The other driver's daughter we pulled from the wreckage later told a paramedic she'd been lifted by an enormous, shadowed hand. Her voice 3 months later trembled when she wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say it too, but the thank you would have required an explanation I didn't have. The werewolf's claim was not malicious. It did not come with bargains written in ink or carved in bone. It came with a ledger kept in muscle memory and howls at the periphery of sleep. It gave me strength, and it took my quiet. It made me someone who could save, and someone who would one day be expected to answer its summons. The line between mercy and covenant blurred into a single, inevitable understanding. To be saved by something so ancient is to hold its appetite inside you like a seed. One night, months from the crash, I stood at the tree line again. The same curve, the same smell of wet pine. A man slumped in his truck, head aslant, blood slicking his temple. The moon watched like a judge. The impulse to run toward him came trained and immediate, a muscle remembering how to do what it had been taught. I ripped open the door with hands that knew how to tear metal now and hauled him free into the mud. He coughed, a thin noise, then opened his eyes and stared straight into mine. For a second there was recognition, but not of me as human. He had looked into something else, into a reflection that did not require explanation, and he had not looked away. There is no tidy ending here. The rescue that saved me set the terms for what came after. I live with the sound of the howl at the edge of everything. A constant like the tick of an old clock. Sometimes mercy looks like teeth and shadow. Sometimes salvation is a claim written in flesh and carried in your bone marrow. I have learned to map my life around it, to answer when the forest calls, to drive slower at night, to keep towels and blankets by the window, to hold a daughter's hand with a tenderness that is almost shameful in its human vulnerability. If there is a lesson, it is this: not all saviors come in robes. Some come in fur and thunder. Some carve their signatures on you and walk off into the trees satisfied. And sometimes, when you sleep, you hear the echo of a wolf's breath press against your cheek, and you know you were spared for a reason you will only begin to understand after the next howl. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist, linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.